And 2.5 years ago, I was what you might call the right hand for my boss who owned the motel that I worked for, technically as a head housekeeper, but I had recently begun training to run the full spectrum of the motel, including all things office and front desk, overseeing staff and minor maintenance, so my boss could take a vacation. It was a 42-room mom-and-pop place, set back off the road, so it was pretty peaceful for the most part. There were still a few motley ones every now and then, but hey, that's at any motel in a small town in the USA. But as intimidating as the new responsibility sounded, with only 2 other staff members to worry about, well, the day comes for the boss to take her leave, and I'm now in charge of her life's blood, sweat, and tears, pumped up for the opportunity to show just what I was made of. She left Friday morning, and the rest of the day ran like clockwork, until around 8:30 that night. I also lived on the property in an apartment, which allowed me to run back and forth to the office for guest check-ins and any office duties I needed to attend to. So when the ring the doorbell alerted, I looked at my phone and saw an older gentleman, early 60s maybe, staring through the door looking for an attendant. I spoke through the camera to let him know I'd be there in 30 seconds and started on my way to the office. As I would with any guest while checking them in, I made small talk about his trip and gave the lowdown on where the good food in town was. I got him squared away in the computer and showed him how to get to his room. As he was getting his credit card situated back in his wallet, I thanked him for staying with us and called him Mr. Logan. He looked up at me and smiled and said I should call him Joe. Then he made his way out of the office. Less than 30 minutes had passed, and I get a call from room 135, Joe's room. He proceeds to tell me that he would like to use the desk lamp, but there's no light bulb in it. Could he please get one? Which immediately threw up a red flag. I had cleaned that room myself, and I made it a habit to check every light bulb in the room. I know for a fact the bulb was there, because I had used the desk lamp as I was cleaning. I told him I would bring one down. He immediately said he would rather come to the office to get it. The office was attached to an apartment-type space that my boss lived in during the week, and it was very dark in the back, set up in a way that would have made it very difficult, if not impossible, to see through the door to the apartment. Considering I was the only employee on the property, having him come to my very secluded office in the dark just wasn't going to happen. I felt more comfortable taking it to his room. This was an old drive-up style setup, where I knew there were other guests around that area that were sitting outside and could help me if I needed it. When he said he would rather come to the office, I told him I would have to bring it down to him because my boss would kill me if I made a guest change a light bulb. He said he understood, and I felt I could breathe a little easier. He's not going to get me cornered in my secluded office to do God knows what. I grabbed the bulb, but before I can even get to the front door, I look, and there he is peeking through the glass on the door, staring me down in the most unsettling way. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I physically started shaking. I opened the door and just said, "Let's get your lamp working nice and right." I started walking past him. He then said he thought he forgot to sign his credit card receipt. Can we go and double check for a moment? I tell him I had already dropped the receipt, but that I would check in the morning and get it from him if I needed it. That was total crap. He made a big deal about finding his good pen to sign it with, but we both know he signed it. With that rejected idea, we continued to his room. As I walked in, I kicked the doorstop wedge that I brought with me under the door, so it couldn't close without assistance. Then had he tried, I would have had time to yell for help from the guys next door to him. I think he figured that out, and stepped away from the door as I walked in. As I put the bulb in the lamp and turned to leave, I noticed the original light bulb sticking halfway out from under the couch pillow. I picked up my pace, chose to say nothing, and left. I made sure that he didn't see where I went, because I sure didn't want him to know that I lived there, or which apartment was mine. 30 minutes later, the phone rings again. Of course, it's Joe. This time he would like extra coffee for in the morning. I tell him I'm unable to get into the housekeeping supply room because the housekeeper accidentally took it home. Total lie. But I wasn't going to go back over there. Something about him had me legitimately scared. He called 2 more times that night, but I changed my voicemail to the motel's information and let him leave a message. I never even checked them. Bad customer service for my first night running the place alone, but I really didn't think my boss would entertain the idea of penalizing me after she'd heard the whole story. The next morning starts out quiet as usual. I was running audit when Joe shows up at the door. I wasn't scared this time because one of my housekeepers was getting coffee in the kitchen, and there were people coming and going and checking out as well. Joe asked me to go to breakfast with him. I explained that I'm on the clock and have business to keep afloat for my boss, but thank you for the offer. Not exactly sure what went down in this next 2 hours because I was working, but somewhere in there Joe's car quit working. He was trying to go to the next town over, which is significantly bigger than my town, for one reason or another. Anyway, he starts getting unreasonably angry that his car won't start, saying things like, "How am I supposed to do this without a fucking car?" and whatnot. Then it dawns on him that there's a car dealership next door, and he starts off in that direction. Before he gets too far away, though, he sees me coming out of a room and says, "You're gonna marry me. Just wait and see. We're going to Vegas," all while smiling and chuckling. I chuckled too because there's no way he's being serious. I hoped. I continued on with my day. About 5 hours passed and I get a phone call from the dealership asking if Mr. Logan had checked out. I said he was booked for 1 more night. He proceeds to tell me that Joe took a car for a test drive and was supposed to return in 30 minutes, but hadn't done so and wasn't answering phone calls either. They asked if I could check his room to see if his belongings were still there. I obliged. I opened his door after knocking with no response and found the room completely destroyed. Papers all over the place, trash on the floor, pictures off the wall, the whole 9. But I wasn't sure if the papers were something he would come back for or if he'd bailed and just left all this stuff behind. Aside from all the garbage strewn about, the only other personal belongings were a pair of swim trunks and a pair of socks. Again, was that worth coming back for? I told the dealership that I'm not 100% sure, so they call the police. After another couple hours, the police show up at the motel, Joe in tow. I had decided since he paid up until the next day, I would just leave his stuff there in case he returned, which honestly I didn't think would happen. He goes in and starts taking his things out of the room. That's when the cop comes up to me, and being a small town, he knows me and pulls me aside. He says to me, "Chaotica, you need to thank God every night that you're still alive and well and here." I was very confused. Okay, but what makes you say that? That man had every intention of taking you with him tonight and going somewhere you'd never be looked for in. I don't know that he would have let you live, even. He's a sick man. We're taking him in for a psych eval, and then to the county if he's okay for general population. He then told me I should call my boss and let her know what was happening. Maybe take my own vacation for a few days, just in case they can't make the car theft thing stick, since the dealership no longer wanted to press charges, given his newly found psychological state. That was technically also the only law he broke. They also said they would patrol the motel every hour or so to check in on me if he was released. I was completely taken aback. To this day, I wonder how he planned on getting me out of there, and what he was going to do if he did. He was released after only 24 hours, but thankfully I never saw him again, and to be honest, I'm okay with that. Alaska is the perfect place to go if you want to get away from the rest of the world. As America's least densely populated state, you have plenty of breathing room from any kind of authority or prying eyes that may want to know what you're up to. For this reason, my home state is very attractive to all sorts of weird and unsavory groups. I've stumbled across Scientology centers at the end of a dirt back road, with nothing else for miles around, heard stories from doomsday preppers who claimed to have bunkers made out of shipping containers in the sides of mountains, and even met people who have come out of religious cults in the interior that wanted to keep their followers away from any contact with the outside world. All this and more you can find in Alaska. I was born and raised in Anchorage, the only big city in the state. Growing up, we had about 250,000 people in a city it takes about 30 minutes tops to drive across, so that gives you a good idea for what we up north consider a big city. The only other real city in the entire state is Fairbanks, really. These two cities are connected by 360 miles of two-lane highway. It's about a 7-hour drive one way to get between them, through the most beautiful landscapes on the planet. The mountains rise up on either side of you, between Anchorage and Denali National Park, before you drive through these colossal canyons, carved out of the rock over tens of thousands of years by melting glaciers and rivers. Past Denali is another 3 hours of driving, through a vast, flat interior plain, with mountains far off in the distance. I say this all to help you understand just how desolate it feels in Alaska, even when you're riding out on the highway. After you get out of Anchorage or Fairbanks, there's nothing but wilderness as far as the eye can see, save for the occasional small town with a max population of about 1,000 people on a good day. And 10 years back, it was even less. Alaskan girls are built tough. We change tires, hunt, fish, camp, and generally have a great appreciation for the outdoors that women in the lower 48 don't really have if they're near a big city. The joke is that Anchorage is the biggest rural city in the country. All this brings context to the following story. In high school, things were a bit different, or at least they felt like they were. I was a young and stupid woman who thought I could conquer anything due to the aforementioned built-tough attitude I was raised with my whole life. Senior year of high school, I decided I wanted to treat myself to a camping trip up in the mountains past Talkeetna. Nothing fancy, just an overnight or two in the most beautiful state at the most beautiful time of the year, mid-June. Going up north in peak summer here always has a weird feeling to it. It feels like the sun never really sets. If you've ever seen the movie Midsummer, that's what it's like. It gets to about dusk, but that's it. It's still bright and sunny out the entire night through. Shout out to readers in the far north of Scandinavia and Greenland. The false sense of security I had, thinking that the midnight sunlight would mean safety, probably nearly got me killed, or maybe even worse. My second mistake was not telling anybody where I was going. I just suddenly one day packed up for my trip, stopped at Subway for lunch, and headed out to the great beyond. The drive was pretty fine. A solid 2.5 hours of driving north along the highway took up most of the afternoon, as I jammed out to the greatest hits on the radio on Cool 97.3. After you get through the Matsu Valley, you get into the mountains once again. Tall spruce and evergreen trees line the road on both sides, with the occasionally empty space where there's been some clear-cut logging. All of this helps to give you a sense that, while you're far out in the wilderness, you're still connected to civilization in some way. And this led me to my biggest mistake: not staying at a state park campground. I was in high school with only a part-time job, and I didn't want to pay the $15 overnight camp fee. I was too scared to risk a fine as well, so I found a spot that looked good and pulled off the road. The map I got from my dad said there was an old mining site up a nearby mountain, so I decided that would be the best spot to head to for an overnight. My logic must have been that it was badass to spend a night in a mining ghost town, or something like that at least. Pulled off the road, packed up my backpack, put on some bug spray, grabbed my map and compass, and started off into the woods. This hadn't been the first time I had done this, of course. I'd been on wilderness backpacking trips on my own with my dad through childhood. I knew my orientation skills, and had taken some wilderness survival courses at camp. I wasn't just some dumb blonde wandering off into the woods with no idea of where I was. At least I thought so. A solid 45-minute hike up into the hills, and I finally made it to where the old mining camp was supposed to be. There was nothing there, though. Just an old concrete foundation with a bunch of holes in it and nothing else. I was disappointed but unsurprised at the outcome. I set up camp off in the woods and set to building a fire for dinner on the concrete slab. Here, you're supposed to set up cooking a ways off from your camp, just in case the bears get a little nosy. The last thing you want is a 1,300-pound grizzly poking his nose in your tent, wondering why you smell like Campbell's soup and s'mores. By this time, it was getting quite late, about 10 p.m., but the sun was still high in the sky, and by the time dinner was over, it was nearly 11. I was starving, and I dug in. About an hour later, it was about as dark as it was ever going to get, so I hunkered down in my tent for the night, confident that the overgrowth was private enough for whatever animals might come out around then. Suddenly, I woke to voices in the distance and slow-moving crashing throughout the underbrush. My first thought was hunters. My dad and I had run into a few on some campouts, so it wasn't really uncommon. I relaxed and figured they would just pass through without incident. I closed my eyes once again. That's when they found my fire pit. A man's voice cried out into the brightish forest. "Hey, who the fuck is camping on our property?" I froze. I knew I had fucked up and was getting up and grabbing my purse, putting on my shoes so I could go apologize. But then I heard the man again. "When we find you, you're fucking dead. You're on private militia property, and all trespassers get shot." That's when the whole situation changed. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just pack up my tent and shit with some armed guy lurking around. I carefully put my shoes on, put my keys in my purse, and slunk away into the underbrush as quietly as I could. My thought was to slip away, wait until they got bored and left, then go back, pack up, and leave. I spent 20 minutes hunkered down behind a log in the woods, barely in earshot, before I heard a second voice calling out for others. They had found my tent, and were tearing everything apart going through my stuff. I heard one shout out, "The bed's still warm." Another called back, "The trespasser's a chick. She left her underwear." The first man shouted out again, "Okay, fan out and find her. Bitch thinks she can trespass? Then there's gonna be hell to pay." At that point, I wasn't concerned that I had left my spare change of underwear in my bag, or that these creeps had found it. I needed to get out of here. Quietly, I made my way down the mountain for a good 30 minutes, tiptoeing and taking care not to step on any twigs or make any ruckus. After the rustling and shouting of the men through the underbrush had faded quite a bit, I said fuck it, and booked it as fast as I could in the midnight sun down the hills. I tripped, fell, and got scraped up more times than I care to remember. Finally, I made it back to the road, but much to my horror, there was no car. I knew I had come out up or down the road from where I had been. I just couldn't quite remember where I was at the time. I picked a random direction and started walking. I rounded a corner on the road eventually and saw my car, with 2 armed men standing watch beside it. They were all armed heavily and dressed in surplus military gear. I hid in the brush on the side of the road and watched for quite a long time. Eventually, several more men appeared from the trail I had taken. They dumped all of my stuff next to my car, hopped back on their ATVs, and just drove off into the night. I went up to my car, careful not to be seen, and found a note on my dashboard. "If we ever catch you on our property again, we won't hesitate to use force. Consider this a polite warning." I went back to start loading stuff into my car and noticed what they had done. They'd cut up or destroyed all of my gear, probably as punishment for trespassing. Honestly, though, I'm thankful they did that, because at least I didn't get shot. Ever since then, I've taken great care to camp only in designated camping areas. And to the weird Alaskan militia group, I know you weren't actually going to kill me, but nevertheless, let's not meet again. At the time these events transpired, My brother, my father, and I, 16 and male, are road tripping through Nevada and California as my graduation gift. It was the end of August, and after a long trip coming from Vegas, cruising through Los Angeles, and heading north across California, we decided to stay in beautiful Santa Barbara for a few days. My father finds a motel not too far from the beach, and we're all in wonder as to the movie-like beauty of the city we're staying in. In the evening of our first night there, being back to the motel shortly after feasting on greasy and savory pizza from Rusty's Pizza Parlor and walking along one of the most beautiful beaches in the USA, I started to get a bit bored in my room. After having watched the television with my father and brother for about an hour, to change the scenery a bit, I decided to peek through our room window. As I kneeled on the raspy purple carpeted floor and drew the thick and heavy curtains out, a sense of dread took over my whole being. I was startled by the thing I see right across the street, only about 100 feet from my window. What I'm looking at is at odds with the beautiful picture-like frame created by the motel lobby entrance arc, delimiting it from my field of view. A beautiful shadow and light setting, created by the streetlight beam on the pavement on the other side of the road, revealed a man whose physical traits were hooded by the shadows cast by the downward light. Right under the streetlight, he was standing half in the light, half in the dark of the night, as if knowing the effect of the lighting had on him. He looked like he was in his late 20s, early 30s possibly, and stared right at me, his gaze like a laser beam. I could feel it all the way down to my kidneys. I couldn't see crazy eyes from this distance, but I could just feel that energy, and my subconscious picked up on the intent, which was definitely not good. He seemed to have been waiting for me to look at him for a long time, as if he somehow knew it would happen. Kind of like how you know you'll always hear thunder after seeing lightning. A few seconds after he was made aware of my awareness of his presence, still staring at me, he starts in a slow-motion clockwork motion, sliding his index finger sideways across his throat, underneath his jaw from left to right, over and over again, silently telling me, "I'll kill you. That's right, I'll kill you." The floor beneath me starts to sink, and a taste of metal overwhelms the top of my tongue. I close the curtains as quick as if my life depends on it. I turn my body away from the window, towards my father, and tell him the weird thing I've just seen. He seems to shrug it off, talking over the baseball game on TV, and tells me to just let it go. But I can feel, along with his calm vibe of arrogant carefulness, a hint of uneasiness that I could just taste in the back of my mouth. 30 seconds go by. I kneel uncomfortably again on the motel carpet just below the windowsill. After loudly swallowing for luck, against my better judgment, I draw the curtains out a second time. This time my hands stop at the width of my head, allowing into view just enough of the outside world to be able to grasp what's happening outside of my safe motel room. There he is again, only this time, the man was standing 2/3 of the way to where he stood the first time I'd seen him. His facial traits were now darkened by the lack of a streetlight, but I could still feel that crazy energy. He was now under the motel lobby parking lot arch. There was not much light where he stood, but I could still perceive him doing his throat-slicing gesture. I started feeling uneasy and frightened. I closed the curtains quickly once again, and told my dad again of the man's presence and his approaching of our room. I get on the bed, trying to concentrate on the TV, to forget what I've just seen. I don't remember if my dad looked through the window to confirm what was happening. I remember him telling me to stop looking outside, though, if what I see is scaring me. We were all safe in the room, which was locked. After what seems like a few minutes passing, I peek for the last time. This time the man is right in the parking lot, only 50 feet or so from our motel room, doing the same gesture once again. I start thinking the man is probably just mentally ill or something, that I'd better stop looking out the window again. A clever thing to do, I tell myself. The man's behavior, although weird, struck me as being ominous and threatening. The night goes on with that feeling that even if I'm probably safe, There's this disturbed man missing a few cogs who's got nothing to lose right outside our room. As far as I know, he could be leaning on the window glass a few minutes from now if this keeps going. Would he be grinning or not? Would he raise his arm to gently tap on the window while kneeling underneath the sill? I tried not to think about it. I slept uneasily that night. The following morning, not wanting to go outside the room, I decided to stay in with my brother, while my father goes to the motel lobby to fetch orange juice, breakfast, and to speak to the motel clerk about the man outside. My father comes back after a couple of minutes with our breakfast, and tells me that the clerk had told him the guy who frightened me the night before was known around the area for his mental illness. He was probably a schizophrenic. My dad also reassures me that the clerk told him the man was not dangerous, and we were safe staying there for another couple of nights. Luckily, I didn't see the man again for the duration of our stay there. Fast forward a couple of years. My father and I were reminiscing about our trip to California, especially those days spent in Santa Barbara. When the mentally ill man threatening me with his finger outside our motel room was mentioned in the conversation, my father, as if relieved from not having to keep a secret anymore, lets out that the morning after that night, the motel clerk had in fact told him to be careful with that man. He was in fact dangerous and very violent. My dad just didn't want to scare us by telling us the truth. I thanked him for lying to me that morning, and we agreed that luckily, we never saw the man again during our stay there. So this happened when my friend and I were 15 years old. We both lived super close to each other, so I'd often go to her place after school to do homework and hang out. A little info. Her house has a park that pretty much backs up to it, and a side entrance to the park is literally right next to her house. It's typically only used by people in the neighborhood, but you're immediately in the thickest part of the woods when you enter from that entrance. It was a Friday, and we didn't really have any homework for the weekend. Her mom had dropped us off at the house and left to do errands, so we decided to go on a walk with her dog. We live in a very good neighborhood with low crime, and we were very familiar and comfortable with this park. And plus, there being two of us with the dog during the day, we weren't all that worried. So we change out of our school uniforms, get some hiking shoes on, and make our way to the park entrance. We start our walk, and the day is a perfect day for being outside. We instantly fall into comfortable conversation as we head off to our favorite part of the woods. And sorry if this is confusing, but I'll try to explain the trail as best as possible. There's a couple of miles of winding paved trail until we run into the first split. If you go left, it'll lead you to the main park area with swings, restrooms, picnic area, all of that stuff. If you go right, it leads to a bridge that will take you to another trail option. We went right to head over to the bridge, since the trail we wanted was over that way. This is where things got weird. We began making our way over to the bridge when we saw a jogger heading in our direction. We both moved to the side to let him pass, but I suddenly got just a really bad feeling. You know the one. Your hair standing up on ends, heart speeding up, a true sense of alarm just by this person's aura. He passed us and stared back at us from over his shoulder a while. I mostly decided, though, that I was being overly paranoid, where he was staring at the dog because who doesn't like a cute-looking dog? After all, he seemed like a pretty average person and was not threatening-looking in general. Still, I tucked it in the back of my mind just to stay a little bit more aware of our surroundings this time. We continued on our walk, which led to another of two trail options. Left continues as a paved area, and off to the right is a dirt trail that's well overgrown in some spots. We took the right because it was deeper into the woods, and it was where our hangout spot was. Our spot is completely off the dirt trail, and we have to walk across a log over a small part of the creek just to get to it. Not many people know about this area, which is why we liked it so much. Most people don't even take the dirt trail at all unless they're bird watching or taking nature photos. We get to our spot, and we hang out a bit just chatting about life. We both didn't have the best home life, and crazy mothers to put it mildly, so it was nice to be able to chat with each other about stuff in privacy. Maybe 10 minutes after we made it to this spot, we heard a branch snap at a distance from us. From where we were, we could just make out that someone was walking along the dirt trail, but whoever it was wouldn't have an easy view of us. We looked over, and my heart just stops. I could just make out the runner from the bridge coming through the trees. He had on bright red shorts, so it was easy to tell it was him. Immediately, though, we both knew that something was not right. This wasn't the kind of trail someone out on a run would take ever. He obviously turned around on his run to head back in our direction. He had originally come from the paved trail that we didn't take earlier, so our alarm bells started ringing. He walked past our spot and quietly continued down the dirt trail, no longer running like he was trying to be quiet. We were at a decent distance, and thankfully he was keeping his gaze forward, where he might have definitely seen us. My friend and I were silently watching. When he was out of view, she turns to me and says, "We need to go now." "Yeah, something doesn't feel right about that guy." My friend just nodded. She let her dog off the leash. She's very good at following, and she would be able to move faster without the lead. So would we. I do have to mention that this dog would not be helpful at all if the situation escalates, because she failed at being a service dog. She was too overly friendly to strangers, i.e. she couldn't stay focused on her tasks. She was very obedient, but everyone was considered a friend, so no help coming from her. He hadn't even been deterred from seeing her to begin with, as she was just a smaller yellow lab. We took off at this point, trying to be quiet and fast, because we will have to cross over the dirt trail that he was on, and we don't want him coming back and seeing us. My friend falls, scrambling across the log into the creek. I slip at the end, so both of us now have very waterlogged shoes. We panicked because of the noise. We just took off, knowing that we had already made a ton of noise anyway. We didn't run back to the paved area, because we were too deep into the woods at this point, and a straight shot was our best bet. Very quickly, we started to hear a noise coming from behind us. She yelled out to me, "He's following us!" I'm not a runner, but adrenaline saved the day, because I could have run a marathon with how scared I was. We were crashing through the bushes, not following any sort of trail at this point, but heading in the direction we needed to go to get out of the woods and closer to her house. We had to have been running for at least 15 minutes, and most of the time my friend was yelling directions to me from behind, because she could see the man chasing us. I'm clumsy, and I knew if I looked back that I'd be the idiot to trip like in the movies. At some point we either lost him or he gave up, but we finally broke through the woods into the field between the woods and the houses in her neighborhood. We jogged close to the fences heading to her house, scanning the edge of the woods and trying to get oxygen back into our lungs. We never saw anything once we made it out of the woods, but we wouldn't feel safe until we got back inside her house. We were a complete mess. She was soaked up to her thighs, and I was soaked up to my calves. At one point I wrapped my hands around branches coated with thorns, so my hands were full of cuts and were bleeding. She had some rips in her pants and shirt. Her dog was perfectly fine though, because she didn't fall into a creek like an idiot, and avoided all the thorns. We immediately started talking, and she said she had the same creepy feeling about the man too, but didn't say anything at the time. She said she noticed that he had given her dog a kind of dirty look, which made her feel very uncomfortable. She had also caught a few glimpses of his face while we were running away from him, and she said he looked absolutely livid. Her mom got home, and we told her what happened. Now, her mom is not someone I'm a fan of. She merely tells us that he was probably an off-duty cop, coming to check on us to make sure we were okay since we were two young girls alone in the woods. Neither of us bought her explanation, but she managed to make us feel like idiots. I never mentioned anything to my mom because she would have just blamed us for going on a walk by ourselves, so nothing ever came of it. That was also the last time we went into those woods, just the two of us. We only ever went with a group of friends or her older brother after that, but we never saw the man again. As an adult, I realized how truly messed up the situation was. The man had to have been 6'2" and in his 40s. I was only 5'1", and my friend was 5'3". We looked even younger than 15, because I still had people at restaurants automatically giving me a child's menu whenever we went out to eat. There wasn't really any excuse for a grown man following 2 young females into a secluded part of the woods when we were very obviously scared of him. It's been over a decade now, and we live in the same neighborhood and frequent the park. The dirt trail is now paved, and a lot of the trees have been cleared away. I still to this day, though, can't go to this park without looking for that man again, or keeping a constant lookout for someone starting to follow me. I truly hope I never meet this creep again, even though so much time has passed.